Would you ever enter a place knowing it is cursed? How would you react if you only found out after the fact? Tonight, I will be telling 3 stories involving cursed locations, from a medic in a hospital to a couple stories involving creepy houses. All 3 of these stories have plenty of terror to share. Thank you to all of tonight's writers. Remember, you can send in your own story if you'd like to have it featured. Stories can either be submitted at my subreddit r/slumberreads or my email that can be found in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Stay safe out there. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. You always think your parents know everything when you're little. You ask questions, and they say things like, "I'll tell you when you're older," or "You'll understand when you're older," when, a lot of times, what they really mean is, "When you're older, you'll understand why I can't tell you," or "You'll understand why I don't know." That's the way I always thought about the Manson house, as something Mom and Dad knew, but wouldn't tell me. I think we all felt that way as kids. No matter what we said, no matter how we asked, the answers were always the same. A scolding for the kids that could be scolded, and an "I'll tell you when you're older, I promise," for the terminally curious ones that couldn't be scolded into quiet. Children get older though, as the song goes, and we grew up with one single statement encompassing everything we knew about the Manson house. Stay away from it. And we all did, except for Jen. I always thought they kept us purposefully ignorant until they thought we were ready to know about things. Like how you don't explain divorce to toddlers because they can't understand it. But no. It was the same old ignorance that's plagued humanity for thousands of years. They just couldn't share what they didn't know. Then again, everyone has to live with not knowing a lot of things, and they get along pretty alright. Personally, I would have been just fine not knowing, I think. Except, on my 18th birthday, we got the call about the girl missing, and all the men in town had put their name in the hat. And old Jack Clinishon called out, "Hold in trust." And suddenly, the choice wasn't mine to make any longer. "How long has it been there?" I asked. "Longer than me," said Dale, spitting into a Mountain Dew cup. Dale was the old-timer on the retrieval. That was the rule. One old, one young. So there was always someone who knew the house. It was supposed to be random each time, so the whole town had to share the burden. But Dale always volunteered for the older guys. He had been on every retrieval mission as far back as I could remember. He'd pulled a lot of people from the Manson house, and given a lot of bad news to a lot of parents. I had met him a few times around town, but never really talked to him. I don't think anybody really talked to him though. Officially, he was the head cashier for the town's gas station. Unofficially, he sold moonshine out of the back door. My mother said he spent too much time in the house, and he wasn't right. Now that I'm older, I think I understand. They weren't really afraid of him, but afraid he might bring some kind of taint back from the house with him, because he'd been so many times. That being said, nobody ever asked him to quit volunteering for the retrievals. Of course nobody did. It had rained earlier, and tendrils of mist were curling up from the hot, crumbling road as the old truck slid forward. We'd long since passed out of town, and there were no houses to pass by. The county wouldn't grant building permits out past a certain point. The trees on either side of the road seemed to bend over it, their leaves nearly blocking out the gray sky overhead. "Is she local, or?" I asked. "Doesn't matter much, does it?" "I guess not. Just wondering if I knew her." "You know a lot of kids, do ya?" he asked, looking at me sideways. I didn't answer. "Look, don't do the things y'all always do with 1,000 questions and everything. It won't make you feel no better, I promise. Besides, I can't answer most of them." "You don't seem too scared," I pointed out. "Well," he shifted uncomfortably, making the truck seat squeak. "You just get used to the fear after a while, I suppose." "Have you ever seen Jen there?" I asked him. He didn't answer. I hadn't really expected him to. We pulled into the house's driveway right as a soft rain began to fall again. The house sat on a bare, grassy knoll, removed from the road about 50 yards or so. Soft, lush grass grew all over the hill, without a weed to be seen. The driveway was gravel, cut and veined by the summer rainstorms. The house looked like it had been abandoned maybe 20 or 30 years ago, sometime in the 80s maybe. The front door was painted in a baby blue that had mostly flaked away, but long strips hung off in ribbons that swayed in the breeze. From the whispers I'd heard, though, that was one of the strangest things about the old place. Nobody knew how long it had sat there on that little hillside out in the woods, but it always looked like that. Like it had been abandoned about 20 or 30 years ago. Even the style changed, apparently, according to my parents. It never changed when anyone could see it, of course, but it changed alright. The house has had quite a few names over the years. One family of Germans that moved in when my parents were young and left before I was born apparently called it the Kaifek House, or something like that. I grew up with a kid whose family moved from Scotland, and his parents always called it Flannan Lighthouse. Most people I know, though, have always called it the Manson House, for obvious reasons. What do? I started to ask. Dale glared at me sharply and held a finger to his lips. Sorry, I whispered. Dale shook his head. Quiet. Always quiet. They don't like the noise. They? I asked. He didn't answer. I took a deep breath and pulled out the little pocket flashlight I'd brought with me. Leave that out here. I didn't answer, but my death grip on the flashlight must have been answer enough for him because he shook his head and pointed at it. It won't help, he said. I promise. You don't want to be able to see too well in there. My knuckles were turning white from how hard I was holding the little light. I stared up at the dark, cobwebbed windows and shook my head. Dale sighed. Fine. Bring it with you if it makes you feel any better. He started up toward the house and I felt my heart race when I realized the crazy old bastard was heading right to the front door. Dale, I hissed. He turned around, holding out his hands in a "what now" gesture. Front door? Really? Ain't another way in. And before I could answer, he'd mounted the creaking stairs and was standing in front of the door. He turned around to look at me, waiting. I was afraid to walk closer to the old thing, afraid to leave the safety of the truck. But my name had been drawn, and there was someone in there that needed our help, so I held tight to my flashlight and walked closer. The grass rippled in the wind, swaying and caressing my boots like little hands. Shadows clung to the corners of the building, and I thought I could see things moving in the windows. The woods grew close on either side of the house, with the overgrowth creeping almost to the daylight, but carefully staying in the shade. The stairs under my feet creaked with each step, and each creak sounded like a scream in the quiet. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until Dale laid a hand on my shoulder. Breathe, he said grimly. Without waiting to see if I took his advice, he gripped the old brass doorknob and pushed. I thought the steps were loud, but the screaming hinges made me wince like I'd been struck. I was taken by a sudden urge to run as fast as I could back to the truck. Dale's taken a lot of people on their first runs over the years, and I guess he knew exactly what I was feeling, which is why he stepped back and, with a sweeping gesture, said, "After you." The hallway was dark, and the air that emanated from the dark corridor was warm and wet, like breath. The gray daylight pooled in the entryway, refusing to go further. The first step felt like stepping into the mouth of some great beast, with a gentle wind blowing past us and out into the open, as if even the air itself wanted out of the forsaken place. Closed doors lined either side, crooked and askew on their hinges. Dale closed the door behind us and the wind stopped. He did it as quietly as he could, but even the click of the doorknob rotating back into place felt too loud and sharp in the dark. With the light behind us gone, the hallway plunged into an oppressive and smothering gloom. The only exception to the darkness was a blue light at the very end of the hall, spilling in somewhere from the left and pulsing gently to the beat of a song that I could barely make out. I turned my head to listen. if you're going to San Francisco. I looked at Dale, the question written across my face in the heavy darkness. My eyes were starting to adjust and I realized I could see a bit better than I thought. The blue glow silhouetted things in a strange way. Creeping farther into the light should have to outline small details in the hallway. He shook his head and shooed me forward. Each step forward took us farther into a musty miasma of urine and sweat that made my tense stomach churn and gurgle horrendously. I thought I might puke, but I bit the inside of my cheek to fight down the urge. When we reached the end of the hall, I saw the light's origin, alongside a sight at once somehow both more and less horrible than I had spent so many years imagining. At first glance, one might be forgiven for thinking it was just a bunch of college kids sitting around, staring at a television on the far wall. Look a bit longer though, and you'll see. The stillness was the first. Apart from the crackling static on the television, nothing whatsoever moved. Dozens of them all sat bolt upright, staring straight ahead, with their lips pulled back into sickening, rictus grins. Their eyes bulged in their sockets, faint blue light glowing from somewhere behind them, and turning their scalra the color of sun-bleached denim. Their clothes, too, were all wrong, with dozens of different styles, from old 1950s polka dot dresses to 1970s bell-bottoms. There were the bright nylon jackets of the 1980s and the ragged farming coveralls of the Great Depression. Be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. The sound drifted from the television, without any of the sound that should have accompanied the writhing static. I could hear it now, as clear as day, but it somehow sounded as if it was coming from a long way away. Like the singer was across a lake from us, and the music was drifting across the calm water. Far away or not though, still it played. If you're going to San Francisco, gentle people with flowers in their hair. Saying Dale quietly under his breath, I turned and found him staring at the television with a dark, pained look on his face. I cocked an eyebrow at him, and he shook his head. He pointed across the room at a wooden staircase hugging the far corner. The banister was broken in multiple places, and the stair runner stained a muddy brown. We hugged the outer wall and picked our way past the huddled masses on the floor. The first stair squeaked loudly when I put my weight on it, and every muscle in my body tensed, ready for a flurry of motion as several dozen bodies heaved themselves after us. But nothing happened. When my muscles unlocked from the sudden freeze, and the pounding of my heart quieted enough for me to hear again, I turned and looked out over the wine-dark sea of faces. None of them had moved. They weren't all suddenly staring at me like I'd expected, with their Cheshire grins beaming at us. They just continued staring at that damned old television set. Only one move that I saw, a young boy of 7 or 8 with freckles on his face. His head turned a fraction of an inch, like he was trying to pull against some magnetic force. I had a feeling that if I was closer, I might have been able to hear the tendons of his neck straining against that force. Whatever force he was fighting though, he lost, and his head swiveled back to the screen. Dale made another shooing motion and gently pushed me forward. Every stair creaked, and every creak made me wince in anticipation, but we made our way up until we stood at the top staring down at the mass of unwashed, mindless bodies huddled in the pulsing blue of the television. Another hallway stretched out in front of me, with half of it open to look down on the living room. "Where is it?" I whispered. "End of the hall on the right," he said. "That's where they keep them, usually, at least." I nodded and started down the hall, stepping carefully on a tattered rug to make as little noise as possible. The hallway up here was darker, and I turned my flashlight on. I looked back to make sure that Dale was behind me, only to find him craning over the banister, searching the faces below. "Dale," I hissed. "What are you doing?" He kept looking for another minute, then swept his gaze up lazily and, with his hands in his pockets, strode past me, not answering and not bothering with the rug. His boots squeaked on the floor as he walked. He didn't crouch, I noticed, or tread carefully in any real way. Instead, he strolled, like a man strolling through a gray winter park. He reached the end of the hall, turned right, and eased the door open. The room was nearly pitch black. There were windows along one wall, but they looked out into nothing but darkness, like someone had either painted each pane with several coats of the blackest paint. I shined my flashlight around the room, but there wasn't much to see. Well, there was the girl, but apart from her. There wasn't garbage strewn across the floor, or cobwebs in the corners or anything. It was like a place made to look old. There was no dust floating through the flashlight beam, no smell of wet wood or mold, just the girl crouching in the corner, squeezing herself into it to get just a little bit further away from us, in the oppressive mugginess of the air. Dale crouched down and held out his hands to show they were empty. He took one slow step towards her, and his voice changed. He'd spoken hardly a dozen words since I climbed into the truck with him, and they were short and terse, but now he spoke quietly and warmly as he said, "You're Rebecca, right?" She shook her head, still trying to push herself further into the corner. Her arms shook. She couldn't have been more than about 12. "You're Rebecca," said Dale. "Your parents told us about you. We're here to get you and take you home." Only 2/3 of that last statement were true, but I decided now wasn't the time to be pedantic. Her arm stopped shaking when Dale mentioned her parents, but she didn't move. She stared at us suspiciously. "I'm Dale," said Dale quietly. He smiled at her, then pointed at me. "That's Holden." She looked up at me. "I read a book about a Holden once," she whispered. "Yeah?" She nodded. I didn't like it though. Before I could think of anything to say to reply, she continued miserably. "I want to go home. Can I go home?" Dale wiped a bit of dirt out from under her eye. "Of course. We're gonna get you home right now. I know this is a little weird, but I need you to check a couple things real quick. So can you turn around once for me, and then lift both your feet up?" She looked at him strangely, but he smiled at her again and said, "I know, it's weird. But we have to check. And if you do it real quick, then we'll be out of here sooner." That seemed to do the trick, and she quickly turned on the spot, holding her arms out while Dale looked her up and down, then picked both of her feet up and showed them. The bottoms were absolutely black from dirt, but apart from that, there wasn't anything abnormal. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "I'll show you when we head out. It's easier to see from up here." Did I do okay?" she asked. Dale nodded. "Perfect." She smiled and she looked so happy I thought she might start crying. "Okay," said Dale. "Here's how this goes though. I'm gonna go first, and you're gonna go right behind me. Just hold on to the back of my shirt. Can you do that?" She nodded vigorously. He nodded too. "Good. Holden is going to come up behind us. When we get to the bottom, Holden and I are going to change places, and I'll be in the back." He looked at me. "I imagine you want to be the first out the door." I was a little indignant at the implication, but, it wasn't exactly wrong. I had actually been eyeing the window for the past few minutes, and considering my chances of survival if I threw myself through, I decided my chances were probably not great. We walked over to the door, holding the knob in one hand. "Any questions?" Rebecca raised her hand, then whispered, "What are they? The things, I mean." The timbers of the house creaked around us as Dale looked at her for a moment. "They're just a bad dream, sweetie. That's all." Then, more to himself, "Just a bad dream." He looked over her at me with a look that I knew said, "But they're not a bad dream for you, so you better look sharp." And then, the good measure at the end, "And don't be an idiot." We stepped back out into the hall and the sound of the television reached me again. The song had restarted sometime while we were inside. "For those who come to San Francisco." Rebecca reached up and grabbed the hem of Dale's shirt, and I walked close behind her as we made our way back down the hallway, lined up like a conga line of the damned, or those old Scooby-Doo cartoons. I had just passed the last door in the hall and we were almost back to the open space at the top of the stairs when a small bit of bunched up rug caught the tip of my shoe. It made me lose my balance. I threw my hand out to the nearest door to catch myself. Unfortunately, the door wasn't closed all the way, so when I pressed against it, it swung with a loud creak and rebounded against the wall with a loud bang, followed immediately after by the sound of my elbow slamming into the floorboards like I was auditioning for a pro wrestling career. Fuck, I moaned, holding my elbow. I'd hit my funny bone, and the entire arm was numb. I pushed myself up off the floor, and that was when I noticed that the room was glowing with the same blue as downstairs. I squinted. There were shapes everywhere in the room, moving slightly, but I couldn't quite make out what they were. The flashlight had spun out of my hand when I hit the floor, and I reached for it. The fall had jarred the batteries, so I had to slap it a few times to try and get it working again. When it came on though, and I saw the shapes, I found I rather wished I'd just left it off. The room was, well, if you've ever seen a crack house, it was pretty similar. Emaciated faces and bodies were laid across one another in every corner, covering the far side of the room, their rib cages squeezing and creaking with every breath. A thin web of glowing blue lines covered them all, like a fine net laid gently over them all, burrowing into their arms and legs and faces. The longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't like a net at all, but more like a root system digging its way through fertilizer. I'd meant to scramble back away from it, maybe shrieking in terror, but the shock had reached everything before the fear did. So, against my own wishes, I found myself kneeling stone still on the floor when Dale laid a hand on my shoulder. What is it?" I asked, a little too loudly. He looked over his shoulder at Rebecca, who was still faithfully clinging to his shirt tail. He leaned in close. "It's where they go at the end." "The end?" "The end," he repeated. "So everyone downstairs?" I let the question trail off. He nodded. I stared at them. Some were so thin I could probably have fit both hands around their waist and touch fingers. Their ribs creaked as they breathed. The thinner they were, the brighter their eyes glowed. Dale pulled me away. "Don't stare," he said. "Why?" "Because it makes it harder to forget." A noise sounded below us, a sort of creaking groan, and he pulled harder. "We have to leave. We don't want to be close when it gets dark." We left, and I made sure to close the door behind us. Listening for the click of the latch, Dale and Rebecca were already at the top landing, staring down at the people below. "Fuck." "What?" I asked, walking over as quickly as I could. I looked down. Fuck. All of them, to a person, were standing straight-backed and empty-eyed, staring up at us. Their blue eyes were glowing brighter, and I noticed that those same blue strings hung from every one of them. On some it hung from their fingers, or the back of their necks, or made a line in their clothes, but every one of them had at least one. People in motion, people in motion. What do we do? "Don't show you're afraid," said Dale. I looked at Rebecca, unsure whether or not she could do that. Unfortunately for me, she seemed to be doing a better job than I was. She'd set her mouth in a thin, hard line, and was glaring at the figures below with her hand still holding Dale's shirt. "We do the same thing we were already planning on. They're not going to attack us or anything like that." "How do you know?" I asked. "Well, I mean, they haven't done it before when this happened." "That's not encouraging," I hissed at him. "Do you have a better idea? You gonna fist fight your way out of here? Just move slow and stay together." We started down the stairs one at a time, with our new audience following our every move. Every creak of the stairs, or squeak of rubber soles against wood, made my heart stop. I was sure that any moment they would rush us, and the last thing I'd see would be those blue eyes bearing down on me. But they didn't. Their eyes moved, and their heads. And when we got to the bottom, we changed positions with me in front. We couldn't go around the outside edge this time, but we didn't have to. They parted around with synchronized, subtle movements, perfectly in lockstep. Rebecca was holding onto my shirt tail now, and practically pushing me by the butt to go faster. Then we were through the throng, and back into the hall, with the outline of the door at the end. It was right there, so close I could almost taste it. I couldn't run though, because something in the back of my mind told me that those things watching us were, despite their appearances, predators. If I moved too quickly or ran, they'd attack. Step by agonizing step, we made it down the hallway, and when my hand gripped that doorknob, I felt such a flood of relief and joy that I knew no feeling would ever match it. No drug or anything of the like would ever give me the feeling of being so alive. The feeling made me shudder. Dale leaned forward and patted me on the back. Good job, kid. Even he seemed a bit happier, and he smiled at me. You did good. Behind him, they all stood together, gathered around the end of the hall, silhouetted by the pulsing blue light behind them with their shadows. For those who come to San Francisco. Summertime. Then the music cut, and the look of dread on Dale's face made my stomach drop into my boots. He spun around and we all watched, waiting, involved in a staring contest with people who couldn't blink. Then the television in the other room started making noise, like a radio zeroing in on a station. Dale, said the voice, oscillating between a little girl's falsetto and the deep bass of an old blues singer. It sounded like someone trying to tune a human voice the same way they might a guitar string. No, said Dale. Dale. It was zeroing in on the pitch now, with the range narrowed down to only include altos and sopranos. Dale. And on the last syllable, it stuck on a pitch and timbre that seemed strangely familiar to me and held out the name until the floor seemed to vibrate underfoot. I shined my light down the hallway just as the mass of bodies at the end of the hall shifted, and parted the same way it had for earlier, only this time, a small girl walked out from their midst, dressed in a nightgown with soft brown hair hanging in ringlets past her shoulders. I've missed you, Daddy. The effect of the voice was strange. The girl's mouth moved with it, but the sound was still coming from the television in the main room, making the whole thing feel like a poorly dubbed film. It had been so many years since I saw her. I'm a bit ashamed to admit that I don't know if I would have recognized her if Dale hadn't whispered, Jen? Don't take my friend, Daddy. She just got here. Please? Rebecca twisted the place where she held my shirt tail, her little hands shaking. Please don't let them have me, she whispered. We won't, I assured her. Dale? Why do you do this every time? Dale asked. He laughed a little as he said it, but it didn't hide the quivering in his voice. It's never worked. It's not going to work. Do what, Daddy? I just don't want you to take my friend away. I just want you to see how happy and safe I am here. Don't I look happy? In the light of the flashlight, the muscles on her face jerked into life, spasming like a spider's leg after it's been crushed, with part of her lips pulling up as the other side jerked into a frown before both sides reversed. With much twitching, though, her lips finally managed to expose all of her teeth in something that, well, if it wasn't a smile, it might have murdered a smile once and skinned its corpse. Don't I look happy? The voice asked, and she opened and closed her mouth completely out of rhythm with the words, her lips pulled so far back so that she looked like those joke teeth would wind up, and then they bounced across the floor. I hate you, said Dale quietly. I love you, Daddy. How can you hate me? I don't hate you, Jen. I hate the thing that's wearing your skin. Laughter erupted from the main room, and the glow behind the figures grew brighter as the little girl's head flapped like it was on a hinge. The staticky effect from earlier started again as the laughter shifted between pitches like a dial-up modem before finally settling back into Jen's voice. I'll wear your skin too, Daddy. I'll wear your skin too, you know. Let's go, said Dale. Dale, now. I twisted the knob and we emerged back into the daylight and the soft rain. I didn't realize just how stuffy the air was until I was out of it. And even with how hot and muggy it was outside, it was a gift from God compared to whatever we had been breathing inside. Dale slammed the door shut and held it for a moment, his hand still on the handle, like he was afraid he might have to hold it closed against something. I started to ask what he was doing, but then I heard him gently sobbing, his forehead pressed against the flaking wood. I looked at Rebecca, who still hadn't let go of my shirt, and she looked at the truck. I nodded, and we left him there, walking through the whispering grass back to the truck. I buckled her into the back seat, and we both sat and waited, listening to the gentle pings when heavy drops hit the cab. Some minutes later, Dale climbed in too. His eyes were a little red, but apart from that, He was the same as ever. We started the truck and peeled out of the driveway, turning the air conditioning on high. Cold wind blew across my face, but I was already shivering. "You okay?" He asked Rebecca in the back seat. She nodded. "Good." He changed gears and sped up a little, the tires cutting through the little rivers of water draining across the road. "Not bad for your first go, Holden. You did good." "Thanks, Dale." I waited for a long minute, deciding to go for it. "You okay?" He shot me a withering glare, his jaw set and his teeth clenched together. He shook his head a single time and made a cutting motion with his hand. I nodded. "Gotcha." I'd just started a new job at a hospital a few states over from where I'd lived. I'd been a paramedic for the better part of 2 decades, and wanted something different and a little slower than working on the ambulance. While looking for other career opportunities, I found a job listing for a medic position working in this hospital's emergency department. To be honest, the job seemed a little too good to be true. The pay was more than what I was getting on the ambulance, and the benefits were amazing. During my interview, the ED manager told me they wanted medics in the lobby for our rapid triage skills. Our time on the truck had given us something of a sixth sense when it comes to weeding out bullshit from true medical emergencies. I'd also learned that while something like this has been done at other hospitals, this position was brand new to Valley Medical Center. I met my other medics on our first day of orientation. I found out that Cliff and Rhonda would take the day shifts and Danny and I would be on nights. That didn't bother me in the slightest. We get to see the more interesting things at night. Our first night would be one that we would never forget. They had us stationed out in the parking lot for COVID screening. They had a makeshift structure under the breezeway that led into the ED waiting room. We jokingly called it the COVID cave. Any potential patient that walked up was first screened by us. A rapid triage was done, and then sent through to the nurses for room assignment. Easy. VMC was a smaller hospital, level 4 trauma center, with a level 1 being the best of the best. Just because it is a level 4 doesn't mean we don't have our fair share of critical patients. The closest level 1 was over 2 hours away by air. For all intents and purposes, we were all they had, and had to think outside the box when it came to stabilizing a critical patient. That night didn't start off too bad, and most of the ED patients were discharged before 2200. When I looked at the board to see how many patients we had, there were only 3 listed. "Hey Sam," Danny called. She was standing just outside of the COVID cave's entrance, looking up into the sky. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" I walked over to her and looked up. The twilight sky had a sickening green tint. "I've only seen the sky turn that color just before a tornado," I offered, "but the radar is clear." "It just feels wrong," she said with a shiver. "I know." "What are y'all looking at?" A voice from behind us asked. We turned to see one of the security officers, Alex, walking up to us. He had only been with VMC for a few weeks, but was a nice enough guy to get along with. "Not sure," Danny said. We made our way back to the fold-out table they had set up for us in the cave. It held our basic supplies, laptop, cooler with water, gloves, thermometers, and such. The next few hours dragged by. We cleaned our area, restocked our supplies, and Alex regaled us with a story of his most recent epic Nerf sword battle that took place at his favorite geek tavern before COVID shut it all down. Let me stop here and say that Alex, nor Danny, were anyone to mess with. Alex had spent 6 years in the USMC. He never really talked about what he did, mainly just gave us the whole "I was a mechanic" spill. Danny spent time in the Army as 68W and earned her CMB. I had never seen time in the military, much less combat, but 16 years working on the ambulance on the west side of Montgomery taught you a thing or two. It was during Alex's tale of the Nerf sword battle that things started to go sideways. He was cut off mid-sentence by a scream coming from the parking lot. We didn't jump into action like you see on TV, but we did get up to see where the scream came from. Running blindly into a situation can get, and has gotten, people killed. 204 to base, Alex called into his radio. "We heard it, 204. There was a slight pause. 202, 206. Need you to respond to the ED entrance with 204. Female subject screaming. Unknown source. How did dispatch hear that? I asked. Yeah, aren't they in the basement? Danny offered. They are, Alex said. Everything okay out there? Our charge nurse, Drew, called over the radio that the staff used. We had to use a separate system to allow for service inside the building. Yeah, did you hear that too? Danny responded. Yeah, it echoed all over the ED. Drew replied. We waited in the cave until Alex's backup came out. As they approached the entrance of the cave, we heard one of them comment on how foggy it had gotten. Danny and I looked at each other and made our way to the entrance as well. Sure enough, in that short amount of time, a thick fog had rolled in. We couldn't see anything past a few feet from the lights of the entrance. As Alex and the other security officers started to approach the fog, one of them hesitated. He looked genuinely afraid. Are you good, Cook? Alex asked. Yeah, Cook stammered. As Alex turned back to the fog, he jumped. The shadow of a woman's figure was standing just inside the fog. Son of a... Alex cut himself off before he got himself in trouble with HR. Can you help me? The woman asked. Her voice was that of a stereotypical grandma. Yes, ma'am. Danny recovered first of us. If you'll just step over here to the entrance, we'll screen you and get you to a room. There was a small laugh. I wasn't sure I had actually heard it, but the look on everyone else's faces said that they did. I noticed that Cook was not taking any of this well. He was getting increasingly antsy by the second. Giggling, the woman spoke. I don't think I can do that. I looked at Danny and she mouthed, Psych patient? Do we need to get you a wheelchair? I asked. Oh no, dear boy. I'm more than capable of walking. The sweet grandma tone was completely gone. It was replaced with a tone of anticipation. It's the light. It just hurts my eyes so bad. I'm sorry the light hurts your eyes, but you'll have to be in the light for a little while so we can check you out. After that, we can put you in a room and turn the lights down to a comfortable level for you. Danny was trying her best, but her offer was just met with silence. What if I get you a wheelchair and just close your eyes, or cover them, until we get you to a room? I asked. We've dealt with enough psych patients to learn when to pick your battles. If she wanted to be wheeled to a room while her eyes were closed, I was more than willing to do it. She remained silent for a few heartbeats and then replied, That would work, but you'd have to come to me. No, Cook whispered in a panic. She needs to come out of the fog. I'm not fighting with her. It's not a problem, I responded. Come on, Johnson. The other security guard followed me into the fog. There was a definite temperature change as soon as we stepped into the fog. It dropped almost 10 degrees. She must have been further in than I thought. I could see Johnson standing next to me in the wheelchair, but nothing else. Stop, Alex yelled. Come back, both of you. Again, some things you just don't question. I walked a few steps back to the entrance, only to realize that Johnson hadn't followed me. What's up? I asked. She moved as soon as you crossed in. We can't see her. I found... Johnson was cut off. Oh shit, get her off! Alex and Cook ran to Johnson's voice. We could hear a struggle, and Johnson was still screaming. My arm! It's gone, man! My arm! 3 gunshots rang out. Danny and I jumped. We stepped back into our cave and subconsciously grabbed our jump bag. Similar to the one we carry on the ambulance. We waited for what seemed like an eternity. Alex and Cook emerged from the fog and were dragging Johnson back to us. Johnson was missing his arm from below the elbow. Our training kicked in like second nature. Danny applied the cat tourniquet to his arm, and I called Drew over the radio. We need a stretcher out here now. Traumatic amputation to the left arm. No sooner had I said that than the entrance doors opened for our trauma team. No words were really spoken. Johnson was loaded up and taken to one of the trauma bays. I told y'all not to go, Cook said. What the hell was that? Alex asked. She ate his arm, man. Cook continued without answering Alex. She bit his arm? I asked. No, man. Her jaw unhinged and she ate his arm. Cook holstered his gun and put his hands on his knees. One bite and she ate his arm. His voice was a bit calmer, but still scared. Check my body cam, bro. It's all there. It was tasty too. The voice called from the fog. Not my normal choice, but it was delicious. Both Alex and Cook drew the guns and pointed them towards the fog. We couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. It felt like it was coming from everywhere. Did you miss? I asked Alex. No. We hit that thing at least 3 times. Another laugh echoed. Tonight is only starting. Tonight, we feast like royalty. With that, multiple figures appeared in the fog. Too many to count. Like royalty. They all spoke in unison. Lock it down, a voice called from behind us. We turned to see the shift commander, Hooks, standing behind us. Sir? Alex asked. Get everyone inside. Lock it down now. Danny and I made our way to the ED lobby. Most of the other entrances were already locked down due to the time of night. Security only had to worry about 2, the ED lobby and the ambulance bay entrance. You think we'll be good here? I asked. Yeah, Cook replied. The sliding glass doors are locked and are made of bullet-resistant glass. Had those put in last year after a nutjob tried firing a gun into the lobby. He pointed at the thick wooden door that led into the main ED. This is the only way into the ED from here. There's a deadbolt system in place just in case of active shooters, along with your regular keycard access. Speaking of, Hook started. Let's go ahead and initiate active shooter lockdown. Cook nodded, radioed to the other security officers, and engaged the deadbolt on the ED door. I should note at this point that the only windows in the lobby were from the entrance. The lobby used to be the main ED, and was converted to the lobby after the new ED was built. I looked over to Hooks, and he was talking to someone on the phone. My only guess was that he called Drew to fill him in on what was going on. Mid-conversation, Hooks looked down at his phone and put it in his pocket. Well, cell phones are down. Hooks commented more to himself. Mine too, Danny stated. The resounding comments of fuck sounded off throughout the lobby as the others tried their respective phones. Landlines and internet connections are down too. Cook called from behind the registration desk. What now? I asked. Well, Alex started. They seem to not like the lights, so unless they find the generators, we should be good. I checked my watch. 0200. Only a few more hours until sunrise. I'm not much of a horror fan, but I do remember enough that most of these things don't hang around in the daylight. I could only hope that this rang true for the things standing around outside. The chatter in the lobby died down as a noise started outside. All of us strained to hear. It was chanting. I couldn't make out what they were saying. Alex and I made our way to the front doors and saw that the fog was inching its way towards the door. I wish that was the worst of it. We could hear screaming coming from the other side of the ED door. What the hell? I asked no one in particular. It's probably Johnson, Hook said, rubbing his temples. And we're just going to stand here and do nothing? Alex just about yelled. That's exactly what we're going to do, he sighed. There is something you need to know. All of you need to know. The screaming grew. Hooks. Drew came over the radio. Johnson breached the ambulance bay doors. Drew sounded oddly calm. Keep them safe. Hopefully, we can end this tonight. He was cut off by static. What about the rest of the staff? I spoke up. Who's going to keep them safe? They've already died at least once. Hooks responded. What? Danny asked, unable to hide the surprise from her voice. Everyone in that ED has already died at least once. Hooks sighed. You never wondered why it was so slow tonight? He asked us. The ones that don't remember what happened get a longing to come back here. The ones that do remember just stay away, for the most part. We sat there in silence for a few minutes. I could tell that Hooks was letting us soak in the information. If someone dies on a death night, the next morning they're returned with a number on their forearm. The number slowly fades over the next few hours. It only returns on a death night. Hooks rolled up his sleeve to show a number 6 on his forearm. The higher the number, the more times you've died. Cook rolled up his sleeve to show a number 4. We normally see the numbers right after sundown. Hook's son. We have a death knight protocol that we initiate. It normally entails going on full diversion so ambulances are discouraged from coming here. What about the walk-ups? Alex asked. They normally don't make it to the door. Most of the locals can feel when a death knight approaches and just stay at home. Cook spoke up. And y'all couldn't warn the new hires? I retorted. I'm sure that would go over great in new hire orientation. Hey guys, and welcome to the team. By the way, our hospital is cursed. Hook's son. Hook's radio came to life. Johnson has broken through the ambulance bay doors. It was Drew, and his voice was eerily calm. Keep those 3 safe. See you after sunrise. The transmission was cut off. Has anyone survived a death night? I asked. Not yet, Cook replied. That's why we're trying to keep you 3 alive. Maybe that will change something, Hooks offered. The screaming coming from the back slowly turned into a dull roar. Danny, Alex, and I just sat in the middle of the lobby floor, not really talking. Hooks took a post by the wooden door, and Cook paced in front of the sliding doors. Hooks looked as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to break the news. His expression turned to one of resolve, and he spoke up. No easy way to say this. In order to bring you back after sunrise, you can't die by your own hand. It has to be by them. I felt the color drain from my face. I wasn't going to ask how he knew, and I'm sure I didn't want to know. Anything else we need to know? I asked. Depending on how tonight ends, we'll talk more after sunrise, Hooks responded. The roar slowly died down over the course of an hour. We strained to hear what was going on. We could hear shuffling and other movement coming from either door. Hooks jumped from his post, and all of our heads popped up to see what was going on. We could hear a scratching coming from the wooden door. We can smell the fresh meat. The female's voice from earlier called. We want it, she giggled. Not going to happen, Hooks called back. You have tried numerous times before, old one, and you have failed each time, she groaned. I still remember the first time I tasted your flesh. Oh, how you screamed. That's funny, because I remember putting a 9mm in your eye, Hooks said with a grin on his face. The woman screamed in rage. It echoed off the walls and in our heads. When she stopped, it left a ringing in my ears. I looked back up to see Hooks laughing maniacally. So, you do remember that, huh? We still have time, old one, she retorted. With that, we were left in silence. 03:17, my watch said. At this point, I felt like it was just taunting me. It had been almost 40 minutes in complete silence. Why don't you just leave the town? Alex broke the silence. We've tried, Cook said. The second we cross the town limits, the numbers show back up on our forearms. Each day we're away, the number counts down. I don't think anyone has stayed away long enough to see what happens when it reaches 0. Which is why they required us to move here to accept the job, Alex said with his face in his hands. Yeah, Hook said. The time started to pass mind-numbingly slow. I glanced down at my watch. 05:46. Not much longer. I sighed with hope. A bang on the wooden door brought me back to what we were dealing with. It was the sound of a body slamming against it. Last-ditch effort? Hooks taunted. I will have them, the woman cried. Something hard hit the door this time. The random banging turned into a rhythmic pounding. Splinters started forming on our side of the door. Hooks just watched the door with a wide smile on his face. I thought this madness had gotten to him, but he was just waiting for the right moment. As soon as a breach in the door was big enough, Hooks drew his weapon, stuck the muzzle in the hole, and pulled the trigger multiple times. The sound of those things screaming on the other side was bittersweet. It showed that they could be hurt, but it also enraged them, and they started attacking the door with a ferocity that I had never thought possible. Cook ushered us behind the registration desk and took up a position next to Hooks. Hooks had reloaded his weapon, and Cook drew his. "Please stay behind the desk," Hooks called over his shoulder. "No heroics." "I," the woman screamed. "Will," the door cracked. "Have." Splinters flew across the lobby. "Them." The door hit the floor. "Not today, bitch." Hooks roared back as gunfire erupted. I'm not sure how long it lasted. There was a mixture of grunts, screams, and fighting. It wasn't until Danny had gotten my attention that I noticed everything had stopped. We eased up from behind the desk to see that Hooks and Cook were sprawled on the floor. No sign of the monsters or that woman. We ran over to the two men that fought to the death for us. I won't go into the state of their bodies. Some things are better left unsaid. Hooks turned his eyes up to us and wheezed. "We did it." He exhaled for the last time. I saw the number on his arm disappear. "I don't want to see the rest," Danny said with a choked voice. Alex and I nodded in agreement. "I wonder what happens." I was cut off by a torrent of wind and a bright light. The wind whipped around us, almost taking us off our feet. The light grew so bright that we shielded our eyes. Just as sudden as it had started, it stopped. All of us lowered our arms and cautiously looked around. Hooks and Cook were standing there, with a glazed look on their faces. Slowly, recognition washed over their faces. Hooks slowly shook his head and ran his hands through his hair. He surveyed his tattered uniform and then noticed that we were looking at him. "Did you?" "No numbers," Alex said. Hooks smiled. He and Cook found a set of chairs and sat down. "What happens now?" Danny asked. "A long talk over a good breakfast." He turned his head to the door just as Drew crossed the threshold into the lobby. He had already changed into a set of spare surgical scrubs and handed both Hooks and Cook a pair. Looking at us, he asked, "I'm hoping that y'all don't need these." "We don't," Danny said. "There's a diner just down the road. I'm buying," Drew said. "Wait till you hear about the diabetic werewolf," Cook said, laughing. I was recently diagnosed with automatonophobia. That is a fear of human-looking figures, such as mannequins, wax figures, statues. You get it. The things that look human but are not quite human. Specifically, I have a fear of dolls. I don't mean like the Barbie lineup produced by toy companies, although they give me a slight discomfort. I mean old, creepy, porcelain dolls. My phobia has become severe enough that I could never allow any kind of dolls in the house, or let my daughter play with them. I'd buy her any toy she'd want, even if it's more meant for boys, but I'd never buy her dolls. Then, suddenly, one got delivered to my house for my daughter's birthday. I found it sitting on the living room couch, staring at me like it had done that night all those years ago. My therapist has suggested that I should write down what happened to me, so that I can start my recovery. I'm writing this down not knowing if it's still sitting in the same spot, or if it's moving, and watching me. The story begins with an old woman who lived in my hometown years ago. She was, as my mom would politely describe her, eccentric. What made her that way was that she was always carrying an old antique doll everywhere she went. Sometimes she'd be carrying it over her shoulder. Other times, she would push it around in an old, rusty baby carriage. She would be seen around town and her house with her doll, not caring about the stares or the things people say. Sometimes she would be seen talking to the doll, as if she thought it could talk back. One person described how they heard her yelling at her tiny voiceless companion from her house, as if it had broken some rule. No one believed she had a husband or children, or any living family left to care for her, which explains why it took a couple weeks before someone found her dead in her house. A kind neighbor came to her property, offering to cut her unkempt lawn and help with much-needed house repairs. Getting no reply after knocking, he opened the unlocked door and found her lifeless in the middle of the floor. I heard she had been found with a look of absolute horror on her face, and her hand clutching her chest. The coroner decided she'd suffered a heart attack, but with no one else with her. She couldn't be taken to the hospital. Her house just outside of town was left empty after she had been moved to the morgue. No one knew what happened to her doll that she carried with her. One day, my friend and I were riding our bikes home after school and decided to check out the old woman's house. It was on the long way back from school. As far as anyone knew, she never willed the property to anyone, and the bank didn't own it either. So, there it sat with no one claiming it. But really, who would want it? The structure was a 2-story Bavarian-style house that sat on a large lawn that had grown out so out of control that it was rather reminiscent of a small forest with its own ecosystem of plant and wildlife. The house looked like it had been painted white at one point, but weathering and stains had stripped it of its brightness. Vines and moss had taken a foothold on the front wooden porch. All the windows facing us were cracked and even broken. A section of the pointy roof was starting to collapse, with nature seeming to reclaim some lost land. The one thing that seemed out of place was the baby carriage the old woman used. It sat in the front yard, rusted from disuse, leaves gathering in the inside, and tears on the covering. My friend and I looked at the house from the sidewalk. It towered over us as it blocked the afternoon sun from its old, pointed rooftop. I knew there was no one inside, but I had a nagging feeling that the house itself was watching us. My friend was recounting to me some rumors that spread about the house after the old woman died. They say her ghost still wanders the house, still talking to the doll, he told me. He also told me how he heard that the doll still sits somewhere in the house. I, meanwhile, kept looking at the house, and a movement caught my eyes. A curtain on the second floor window showed slight movement but looked like someone had parted it. I told my friend about it, and he just made fun of me for seeing things. I bet you couldn't spend a night in that place. He accused me with a sneer. I could if I wanted to. I protested, always trying to be brave to my friend, for some reason. Sure, he said to me. You know the Back to the Future movies when Michael J. Fox got triggered when someone called him a chicken? Well, for me, this had the same effect. I took him up on his dare, on the condition that I'd take pictures of the inside so he knew I wouldn't just run away. Later that night, I waited for my parents to fall asleep before sneaking out of the house. I quietly exited my room and down the hall to the back door. It was more silent and farther away from my parents' room. I grabbed my bike and rode out of the neighborhood and eventually outside of town before I reached the old house. It seemed more menacing after dark. The old house was illuminated by the light of the moon. I placed my bike on the sidewalk and made my way to the old structure, observing the window on the second floor. The curtains remained still. I took my first pic of the house. I made my way through the large grass and finally made it to the front porch. My foot leaned on the first step, causing a large creak that echoed through the yard. I pressed forward to the front door. It had an old-fashioned knocker in the middle. It had the shape of an eagle, its wings open in flight. It might have been bronze, but time had rusted it to a dirty brown with chipping paint. I reached for the door handle, and surprisingly, it turned. Weird, I thought. It probably would have locked this door. However, since no one would take this place, why would it be locked? I opened the door to see a darkened entryway. My phone had a flashlight app, so I reached for it immediately to turn it on. The entryway led to a long dark hallway with an open room at the end of it. The floor was covered in dust and trash. My flashlight had exposed some rats and insects hiding in the filth. The part of the floor that wasn't covered in trash showed a flower-patterned carpet. Its color had long since faded. To my left of the entryway was an ascending staircase. To my right, there was a smaller room that I think was the parlor. The room was empty aside from some closed windows and furniture that was covered. The floor wasn't as littered in here as it was in the hallway, but I could see another old flower-patterned carpet. The exposed wood was old and splintered. I snapped a few pics on my phone. I walked out of the parlor and back in the entryway. I stood over the middle of the floor. This was supposedly the spot where the old woman was found. The silence of a lifeless house had surrounded me. I pressed forward down the dark hallway. There were several paintings on the walls. They looked like portraits. The old lady featured frequently in them. After a few steps, I found myself stepping on something hard yet flexible as it squished under my shoe. Then, I heard a faint but very unmistakable high voice say one word below me. Mama? Either the word or voice caused me to freeze in place. I looked below me to see the source of the noise. I found a lonely baby doll laying atop the litter. It had synthetic blonde hair and a dirty pinkish dress. I picked it up to inspect it. It was about the size of my phone. It had dirt and filth covering its face and clothing, its pink dress losing color. The face had suffered the most damage. There was a large tear in its plastic face, the scar showing the hollow inside of the head. I squeezed it again, and it gave out another mama. The voice box still operating but very faint and muffled. I placed the doll back on the floor after taking another picture of it. Further down the hall I went. The room at the end turned out to be a large kitchen and dining room mix. The stovetop was covered in a layer of dust and grease from never being washed. The table was covered in a white cloth with dirty dishes on top of it. I found another doll sitting in a chair at the end of the table. This one was wearing an old sailor's uniform. It looked more male than the first one I saw in the hallway. I walked to the sink to find pots and pans flooding it. There was a layer of filth, stagnant water underneath them from the amount of food matter and mold accumulating at the bottom. The pots and pans were never washed, food matter and grease being caked into them. The sink smelled terrible, like as bad as it looked. I took another picture of the room before leaving. Outside the kitchen I found a closed wooden door. I opened it to find an old, very unclean bathroom. The tub and sink, both of which were supposed to be white, had yellow stain and mold inside the receptacles. The worst thing, however, was the toilet, which looked like the stuff of nightmares. Dried fecal matter covered the inside as it was drained of all water. To this day, I can't use anybody else's bathroom without thinking about that mess. I quickly shut the door while trying to keep myself from vomiting from the sight and stench of that bathroom. I stood outside and waited for the feeling of nausea to pass. Then I heard a sound. The house itself was dead quiet until now, with nobody else but me here, but I could make out the sound of something creaking upstairs in a room above me. I know old houses make noises like creaky floorboards, drafty spaces, and maybe rats in the walls. This, though, sounded deliberate, like there was a rhythm to it. It went back and forth. I walked back down the hallway toward the staircase, shining my light up to the darkened second floor. The creaking sounded much louder from where I was standing. It was coming from up there. I should have left at that moment and forget the whole thing, but instead, I pressed upward, trying to be brave myself. The carpeted stairs made a muffled creaking sound as I climbed up. Total darkness greeted me as I went up farther. Not just darkness, but a pitch black void with no discernible shapes. I reached the top of the stairs and turned the light on the second floor hallway. This one was a lot shorter than the main hall downstairs. There were 3 rooms, with the first 2 being closed. The one to my right was slightly open, and I could hear the creaking coming from in there. I began to tense, and my eyes widened. My heart was thundering in my chest. I was beginning to think that someone was here. Maybe it was some homeless person or junkie who had no other place to go. That didn't seem possible because it looked like there was no signs of anybody living here. I started to have the idea that the old woman's ghost was in the room, waiting for me. I apprehensively approached the open door. I got close enough to peer through the crack in the doorway. I peeked through the crack to see the source of the noise, and my heart felt like it was lurching out of my chest from what I saw. I could only make out the part of the room through the slight opening. I could see the window with the moon shining outside, and an object moving back and forth across my sight as it sat in front of the window. It looked like an old rocking chair moving on its own, the back facing me. I opened the door to get a better view and make sure my eyes weren't fooling me. Sure enough, it was a rocking chair that still looked in good condition with its smooth wood and paint that didn't peel. As the door opened fully, the rocking chair suddenly stopped, giving some slight swing as its momentum came to a grinding halt. When it stopped, so did the creaking. I paused, debating whether I should approach the old chair. It looked like no one was sitting in it. How could a rocking chair move on its own? I walked toward the chair, bracing for whoever might be sitting in it. I didn't find a homeless person, a junkie, or a ghost, but it definitely wasn't empty. Another doll. This one was a porcelain doll about the size of a 5-year-old. It had painted brown hair and painted freckles and dirt covering its face, which was illuminated by the moon. It was dressed in a small suit that had tears in it. I wanted to take a picture of it. I reached for my phone, but when I turned the camera on, the image kept getting fuzzy no matter how hard I adjusted it. Finally, I went in to inspect it. It was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen. Its pale blue eyes, though motionless, seemed to have followed my face. The doll was utterly motionless. I thought there was no way it could have moved the chair on its own. I poked it to feel what it was made of. The torso was stuffed with cotton or feathers. The porcelain head was the only thing that had any weight to it. Still not enough to move the rocking chair the way it moved. I decided to check out the rest of the room, trying to put that creepy ass doll out of my mind. This looked like a playroom. There were games all around, more toys than I've ever seen, and books filling a whole shelf. It looked like this room hasn't been used in years. To the far side was an old dresser with a mirror attached to it. The wood was painted a dark blue, but may as well have been black for the minimal amount of light in here. The mirror was covered in a thick layer of dust, like it had snowed all over the glass. I took my hand to wipe the surface of the dust. The room was a lot clearer in the mirror now. Then my eyes turned back to the rocking chair, and I froze, fear coursing like an electric charge through my nervous system. My body became covered in goose pimples, and my hair standing straight up. There's no way it should have moved. There's no reason for it to move its head to face me, but that's exactly what it did. Its head turned in my direction to look in the mirror. Its reflection was looking back at me. I quickly turned around, the doll now directly facing me. The face seemed to have changed into a glare, as if it considered me an intruder in its world. Then I saw it moving again. The rocking was slight at first and silent. Then, as the momentum picked up, the creaking came back as the legs rocked across the rickety floor. This was the part I decided to get out of here. I looked to the open door to see how far it was. Only a few feet, but it may as well have been a whole mile. I moved my eyes back to the doll, making sure it didn't do anything else. As I got closer to the door, I got farther out of the doll's sight. Maybe I could leave without it moving. Or, at least I thought I could until the chair turned around, creating a loud screech that reverberated through the room. The doll looked directly at me again. I hurried out of the room and slammed the door behind me, shoving my body weight against the door to keep it barricaded. My heart pounded as adrenaline and fear circulated in my blood. Sweat covered my forehead as my body heated up. I felt like I must run, but fear wouldn't let me. I was trying to recuperate when I heard the jiggling of rusted metal coming from my side. The doorknob. It was trying to open the door. It was unsuccessful at opening, but that's what it was trying to do to get to me. It continued for a few seconds before it stopped completely. I took the chance and got the hell out of there. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping on the final step as I ran to the door. It was blocked by another porcelain doll, sitting in the entryway while it blocked my way out. This doll had a clown face with a hobo outfit. Fear had kept me from moving or kicking the doll aside to run out. My panic spiked again as I heard the door from upstairs open, and the sound of tiny footsteps were running down the stairs. I had to hide. Where? Frantically, I searched the darkened room for anywhere to hide. I found one door straight ahead as I peered through the darkness. I bolted for it and slammed the door behind me, pressing my head to the wood. I couldn't hear the footsteps. Silence. Sweet silence. I resolved to calm down and then find a way out. I turned my way back to the door and turned on my light to see the room I was in. True terror filled my being as I tried to scream, but it ended up being caught in my throat. More dolls, shelves and shelves of them, various sizes, designs, and colors. This was a whole storage room full of them. They were all in various states of disrepair. Some were missing eyes, limbs, or heads. Others were covered in dirt and filth. The biggest one was another clown doll in orange clothes and blue hair with black eyes in front of me. I checked each of them until movement caught my eye. One of them turned its head towards me, then another. Then one with no eyes started looking at me. Then they were all looking at me. They were all looking at me. I ran out of the room to find some escape. I didn't remember seeing any other door going outside while exploring, so that left only the front door, which has the clown doll sitting in front of it. With no other way, I ran to my only exit, picked up the doll, and threw it so hard I heard it break into pieces as I bolted out the entryway and into the front yard. I got to my bike in no time, then rode off. I swear I heard multiple footsteps behind me. I rode so fast I felt like I was flying, never once slowing down to catch my breath. I didn't stop until I reached the stoplight on my block, and then decided to have one brave look behind me. Nothing. I wasn't followed by anything. I still rode back to the safety of my house and locked myself in my room all night, always peering through the curtain. Daylight didn't come fast enough. I never spoke to my friend after that night. and I did not want to be around dolls for any length of time. I also avoided that house completely until the day that old shithole got demolished. Hopefully. So was everything inside it. Even with that, I still had a sense of paranoia that one of those dolls would find me and show up at my doorstep. Turned out, one of them did. It was my daughter's 8th birthday. A package came with her name on it, but no return address. It did have a plain card on it with only 2 words, "Happy birthday." She opened it up to reveal the same doll from the room upstairs all those years ago. Its appearance is cleaner than before, looking brand new in fact. Seeing that damn thing sent me into an anxiety attack so bad I locked myself for 2 days in our bedroom. My wife, who used to find my fear of dolls amusing, now showed genuine concern for me. She told our daughter to keep the doll in her room. I never saw it do anything after that, making me think that I had probably hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe, if it weren't for one thing. I installed a nanny cam in our daughter's bedroom, and I keep as close an eye on it as I can. It'll usually be facing the wall, but whenever I turn my gaze away, even for a split second, its head turns towards the camera, looking at me through the other side of the lens.
What is the scariest encounter with another human you have ever experienced? Have been home invaded 3 times, once by 2 guys who had a gun, a knife, and a bottle of petrol they splashed all over everyone, and the other 2 times by 4 dudes with knives. Got stabbed one of those times, only in the hand, but they were going for my face. Luckily, I was fast enough to catch it. Those experiences were pretty freaky and taught me a lot about how savage and animalistic people can be. I was investigating a fire for an insurance company in a fourplex in North STL. North STL is a bad area. It was clearly an arson. I had 5 separate, unconnected fires. I'd been there for a while, taking photos and doing my thing. I was drawing my diagram in the building when I hear 2 guys walking by the building on the other side of the wall. I'm straining to hear what they're saying since it could be pertinent to my investigation. The 2 guys get to the rear of the building where the fire department had ripped out the wall to be able to extinguish hot spots they'd found. I can clearly see them both standing there talking. They start to kick through the debris on the ground and one starts saying how some dumb woman had snitched on his buddy for setting this fire. He starts telling the other guy about how he's going to deal with her and pulls a god-darned pistol out of his waistband. At this point, I'm frozen in fear, about to crap my pants, hoping that they don't look 90 degrees and see me standing there like a jackass. So I crouch down as low I can without making noise and wait. They continue to talk about how it's bullcrap she told the cops on him and blah blah. Finally, a car drives by and I use the sound of it to get out of the house out the front door. Which unfortunately wasn't super quiet since most of the floor had collapsed and I was wearing fire boots. I get to my truck across the street. I'm sitting in the driver's seat trying to unclench my butthole when the guy with the gun walks around the side of the house to the front porch, sits down, and aims it at me. I turned the truck on and got the F out of there. I ended up going back about an hour later to see if they were gone because I had to finish my scene. Still top 5 scariest moment of my career so far. I was at a sleepover at my friend's place. We decided to sneak out and wander around aimlessly. We stopped at our school, which had a small patch of trees on the grounds where the older kids hung out during lunch. There was rumors of a great Playboy collection there, hence our visit. While there, my friend stepped off to the side to have a pee. A few seconds later he comes rushing back and says, "Run." I didn't know what his deal was, but as a kid in the forest with only the light of the moon, I figured asking questions was a secondary option to being left alone there. We ran until we couldn't run anymore. Finally, my friend explained that there was some weirdo looking at him go pee. He said that he believed the guy was jerking off. Being kids with a history of pranks, I thought he was effing with me. Then I looked back and saw the guy a long way back but moving in our direction. We kept running towards my friend's place and he kept following. When we got back we thought we lost him. We snuck back inside and turned off all of the lights in the basement. We laid there silently and terrified. About 10 minutes later we see something move by the window. We knew someone was out there. We stayed completely still and quiet. A minute later we hear a noise coming from a room in the basement. We both lost it and started yelling "Dad" for my friend's dad. He came running down the stairs and we were yelling "Someone's in that room." His dad flung open the door and the window was open and there were fresh marks on the wall from someone climbing in or out. For some reason he didn't call the police. He decided to stay downstairs with us for the night. I didn't really sleep and in the morning my friend's dad made me walk home with him. A few blocks away and there were a bunch of police. As we walked by, one of the cops stopped us and asked if we saw anything suspicious last night. We told him the story, which kicked off further questioning. It turns out that a kid went missing from his room right around the same time that we got chased home. They found the guy a few days later dead from suicide. They never found the boy he abducted. We had a lot of trouble with that. My friend's dad felt guilty for not calling the police. He became addicted to sleeping pills. My friend was traumatized with just how close he came to being grabbed in the forest. He turned to drugs really young and eventually killed himself. I went through therapy for a while and still have occasional night terrors from that night, even though it happened almost 30 years ago. Drunk driver tried to mow me down on my moped down a dead-end street. Luckily I managed to get my bike up the pavement and put a parked car between me and the drunk, so he couldn't get me. Pretty intense. I had someone try to run me down in broad daylight as I pushed my 3-month-old in a stroller. I got stuck on the curb and just picked up the whole stroller and ran. When my daughter was too small to go into the bathroom by herself, I would take her into the men's room with me. Once we were at a park and my daughter and I were standing in the restroom waiting for my son to finish up, and some random, normal-looking middle-aged guy came in to use the urinal. When he finished, he turned around with his penis still hanging out, took 2 steps towards my 3-year-old daughter and waved his penis in her face, then made a beeline for the door. It happened so quickly and was so unexpected that I was too stunned to react for a moment. Once I realized what had just happened, I ran out to find him, but he was gone. He must have raced straight into the woods to hide or something. At the time, I was furious that he got away, but in retrospect it was the best thing that could have happened. I was experiencing the sort of blind rage, where if I'd embraced it even a little, I'd have completely lost control, and I wanted to embrace that rage a lot. I shudder to think about what I might have done to that guy in front of my kids, and the likely legal consequences I could have faced. Me and my boyfriend came back at like 2 a.m. from a night out. We were both quite drunk and stumbled into the hallway to the elevator when we see drops of something on the floor. It definitely was blood. Fresh and wet. The elevator button and door were covered in bloody handprints as well. My boyfriend called the elevator, pushing me aside not knowing what would be in it. Luckily nothing except for a puddle of blood. The elevator came from the 5th floor. So we went investigating. The trail of blood ended at a door with huge hand smears of blood on the door. It took all our courage to ring. Not the nicest place to live, robbery? But I am so glad we did. An elderly man opened the door. He looked like straight out of a horror movie. Covered in blood from head to toe. His gray sweater was red. His hair was wet. His shoes were filled with blood. We immediately sobered up. I called an ambulance which arrived in 2 minutes. My boyfriend went inside the flat helping the man sit down. There was so much blood I have never seen that in my life. We didn't know what happened to him until we met him yesterday properly for the first time. Recognized my boyfriend's glasses. He was drunk, wanted to ride his bike home, crashed somehow and got a huge cut on his head. He takes heart medicine which thins his blood, that's why he lost so much. If we wouldn't have rung the doorbell, he would have bled to death. He actually gifted us money and a super expensive bottle of champagne for something completely self-explanatory. I was up in my 3rd floor bedroom having just had a spliff chilling to music with my headphones on when I started to hear weird noises. Naturally I just thought it was because I was stoned, but it was weird enough for me to take my headphones off. I listened for a bit and coming from downstairs was a creepy voice I didn't recognize mixed in with John's, my housemate's, voice, but he sounded like he was in pain. I was like WTF, so I started walking slowly down my stairs and then looked into his room and saw John on his floor holding his eyes in pain with a big dude in a hoodie shouting at him and then grabbing things off the shelves. The next thing I knew, autopilot had kicked in and I ran towards the room and the hooded dude turned, ran out the door when I smashed into him, making us both go tumbling down the staircase, trying to exchange punches on the way down. We scuffled a bit in the hallway until he eventually ran out the door. It transpired that John, who at that time was on crutches, was hobbling home and went to open our front door, when the hooded dude came up behind him and pepper sprayed him in his face, blinding him. He then took him up to his bedroom to rob him and his stuff. Poor guy had to have iPads on for the next 2 days. Anyway, it was all pretty effed up, but John was okay in the end, and honestly I was so stoned it didn't really feel like it was happening at the time. Was like a bad trip. All moved out 2 weeks later. Was Brixton in London. Late 80s, was running errands in town with my mum and 2 sisters. Back then it wasn't uncommon to leave your kids in the car while you ran inside the store. We are sitting in the car waiting, and then I see an older guy walking towards our car. I just get a really bad feeling and start yelling at my sisters to lock the doors, while I lock the 2 on my side. He comes over and spends the next couple of minutes trying to open all the doors on the car while we are cowering in our seats. Eventually he gave up and left. We were all 8 and under in age at the time. I just knew that if he got in the car he would take one of us. This happened at our local grocery store 6-ish years ago. A mom left her 10-year-old daughter unattended in the car. It was hot out so the windows were down. A man noticed the kid and ran over to the car, yanking the girl by her hair and arms trying to pull her through the window. The girl started screaming, which caught the attention of another guy who came to her rescue and fought her attacker off. Police never found the creep or the truck he took off in. That little girl, had she not fought as hard as she did and without the help of guy number 2, would be dead or worse right now. No matter the year, the temperature, the location or type of store, never leave your kids unattended in the car. There's too many things that could go wrong. I'm sorry you and your siblings went through this op. My landlord's brother was high on angel dust and held me hostage for several hours. He was partially retarded, so I was able to drift his thoughts toward French toast and bong hits. I charmed my way out of getting raped and murdered. I will never forget his face in the bathroom mirror as he held my bleeding hands under the faucet water, while berating me, eye to eye, in the mirror. So scary. Back in the early 90s I worked as a night auditor for a small motel in Prospect Heights, Illinois. I was a young mother and worked nights while my husband worked days. Occasionally, my husband would stop by and check on me. It was a brutal schedule and I truly don't know how I made it on only a couple hours of sleep each day. But I digress. My job was to perform a daily audit on the rooms and money. Also, I would check people in and out of the hotel. The hours were midnight to 8 in the morning. One night I had finished my audit and was watching a scary movie on the little TV they had behind the front desk. It was winter and very cold. A man came up to the door and he was wearing a ski mask. For a second, I thought it was my husband, so I kind of smiled. He came up to the front desk and I asked if I could help him. He asked me why I had smiled at him. Well, I knew right then I was in trouble. He waved a big knife at me and told me to turn around. I felt the most fear then. I felt like I was going to die. He hopped over the front desk and cut one of the phone lines and took the money. I had my coat and purse back there and he took those as well. As he left he said, "I have your purse, I know where you live now." I stayed hunched in the corner behind the front desk as he left. Then I realized he had only cut the handset to one phone and the main line on another, so I took the handset from one phone and attached it to another where he had not cut the main line. I dialed 911 and got an operator on the line. Just as I was about to talk, the guy came back. Apparently, he had dropped his knife behind the desk. I saw it on the floor as he came around. I picked it up. In my mind I'm thinking, can I stab him? We stood there kind of facing each other. Me in my uniform and this big guy in a thick ski jacket. He demanded I give him the knife. I truly thought if I tried to stab him I would lose and he would kill me. I gave him the knife. He took the knife and hit me over the head with the handle of the knife a couple of times and then left. The police soon came and I recounted my story. As far as I know, he was never caught. The place I worked for let me have a day off, but when I needed more, I had head injuries, they fired me. It turns out, they had been robbed a few times before but had never put in security. I did take them to court for lost wages and I won. About a year later, maybe less, I saw on the news that a night auditor/clerk at the same hotel had been kidnapped from the motel, raped, stabbed and left for dead. They caught that guy and he is now in prison. I am literally shaking as I type this. It's been so long, but I rarely talk about this, or I just laugh it off like it was no big thing. Obviously it still affects me greatly. Scariest night of my life. The hotel, when I worked there, was an Econo Lodge, but they apparently changed the name soon after I left, to Forest Lodge. So when the story about the kidnapped clerk came on the news, I didn't immediately realize it was the same motel. Until they showed a photo of the motel. Then I knew, and it scared the crap out of me. My father. He was a piece of crap sperm donor, and the time he was barely in my life he messed me up. I remember my mother telling me to run when he came home angry or drunk, to lock my bedroom door and turn on the TV. I could hear him screaming, breaking things, beating up my mother, banging on my door, trying to bust in. Police coming, my mother crying, him being back that same night or next morning, and hit repeat. Sometimes she couldn't do anything and I would be involved, and he would use me as a punching bag and I would be thrown around like a rag doll. He would rip my mother's clothes off and force himself on her in front of me. He would always be let go because he had friends that were police officers. One night I woke up and heard my mother crying and went to our front door that lead to the apartment stairs and opened the door to look down. I remember I said something but don't know what, and saw my mother bleeding and her shirt ripped off. He came up the stairs and I looked up and remember him punching me hard, not sure if he punched more than once, but remember my head hitting the coffee table and nothing else. I don't remember what happened days after or anything, but remember the judge giving my father weekend custody of me and me crying whenever I was forced to be with him. He would act like a different person in public and sometimes at home, and out of nowhere he would be someone else. He eventually stopped picking me up and never saw me again. I was around 5, but he left his mark. I remember him shooting up with me in the car, drinking and driving with me, touching me and other kids, him pulling out a gun or knife at people, and so on. He was a very scary person to be around and left destruction to anyone of the female gender he stayed close to. Was trying to take my girlfriend to the hospital since we thought she had appendicitis or something. It's like 12:30 a.m. on a Sunday in Fayetteville, NC, which, if you don't know, is an absolute crap hole. We get 2 streets away from where we were living when we come across this street racing type car, neon lights on the rims and stuff, pulled out halfway into the road. I stop and wait a while for it to move and it doesn't. So I pull around it and keep going. The car accelerates and cuts me off around the bend. It slows down and won't let me past. A second car pulls up on the right, a third car pulls up on the left. At this point we're boxed in. A young black guy wearing a white tank top and khaki shorts gets out of the car holding a pistol. Someone else in the car hands him a blue bandana, then he starts walking towards us. At this point I'm starting to realize that this is too many people for a robbery, and there was a reason for him being handed the bandana, and it's probably a gang initiation. So I throw the car in reverse and bump a fourth car I hadn't been looking at because I was looking at the guy with the effing gun. I throw it forward and go to squeeze past the car on the left and the front car when the guy started shooting. He fired 3 shots, that thankfully didn't hit either of us. It's important to mention that at this point we're on sort of a back road a bit away from a 4-way intersection with a stoplight. Across the street there's a shopping center with a 24-hour grocery store across the street. I speed through the red light with the intention of going to the store and asking for help. Before I can make it across, we get T-boned on the passenger side by a completely unrelated vehicle that was going 55 miles per hour. Car span out, ended up on the side of the road and was totaled. The guys in the cars effed off once other people were involved. I ended up getting a traumatic brain injury and whiplash from the car accident and was paranoid as hell for a very long time afterwards. Girlfriend ended up mostly okay, some bruised ribs and whiplash as well. Watching TV when I'm suddenly face to face with a SWAT dude pointing a pistol at my face. Anonymous call/wrong address that nearly got me shot. Shake my head. This was before swatting was a thing, by the way.